Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This is a live webinar, so please make sure you sign into the platform that you're watching from. That may be something like Twitch or Facebook. And I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. Arista and Blackhawk Data, we're the ones sponsoring, Blackhawk Data is sponsoring the event. They work closely with our team to help design and implement all of Arista's private and public sector solutions. And we're proud to call them the first Arista certified professional services partner in the US. So I'd like to welcome you all, and we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. So today we're going to talk about how to detect and contain ransomware before it wreaks havoc. And as we jump in, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, and then we'll also just go ahead and go through and talk to the threats today. So myself, I'm a network threat hunter, a VP in the Awake Labs division of Arista. We got acquired back in October as an NDR platform focused on security. We got more than 20 years in the industry, and you can see some of the names I worked for there. I spent about 7 years in Foundstone at McAfee, several years at FireEye, and a few at Silence prior to coming over to Awake, and through multiple different startups. You can follow me on Twitter at HackersAgents. And, I think just in general, I have a pretty big passion for security. I read a lot in my free time, and I enjoy researching things like ransomware, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and dive in, and I'll talk about what we're seeing. So I like to use this Avedon threat as an example. They're still one of the survivors after the latest dark side situation we had in the Colonial Pipeline. But Avedon today, I saw 9 new groups, 9 new companies came onto their site that were hit by them, and they're posting their data. So again, they're very active in the industry, and this is just an example of what you run into. In this case, they're putting up $1 million ransom to a company, and what they also do is they provide a lot of threatening information, and you see that with the Clop Group, Avedon, a few others, where they're going to call your customers, they're going to DDoS you, and they really go through a lot of pressure tactics to help you, give in and pay the ransom. And we'll talk about that later at some point. But this is a significant threat. We saw the pipeline got taken down the other week, and we want to make sure that you're doing all you can to help prevent it before it damages your network and before you're taken offline and it affects your business. So a couple of key things we want to go through, and really it's about the timing and how you can get in front of the attackers before they get far enough in the kill chain to encrypt you. And, we do know days matter. In the case of somebody like Ryuk, I've been on engagements where we've had about 3 days from their initial infection to encryption, and we prevented the encryption entirely by kicking them out of the network. So, in general, you look at what Gartner calls the SOC triad. And that's what I'm showing here on the right in the triangle. And what the SOC triad is, it gives you visibility across the different components in your network. And I'm specifically going to do a little bit more of a deep dive today into the NDR component and how it offsets the other two. But most people are familiar with EDR. And if you're combating ransomware and you don't have EDR in place, I can tell you that's the first thing you really need to get in-house. We come in multiple times. That's the first thing we have to push out to help contain the environment, as well as make sure we're detecting it on the endpoints that are managed. Now, logging, not everybody may have a SIM, and you may not be able to log all your platforms. And especially when you get into applications and different devices, it becomes hard to consume all that log data to actually go through, do the right analytics, and detect on it. And when you've got endpoint there, we know about 40% of devices are unmanaged. We know with logs, you can't log everything, and that's where NDR comes in. And the network, which some call the ground truth, really does give you a pretty good view into all the other aspects and what's going on. So let's just take a basic ransomware attack and how it progresses through the environment. And for anybody who does open source intelligence, you know that the front end of this, the initial recon, kind of goes in that same space where you've got these groups harvesting data. I mean, everybody's on Have I Been Pawned. Shodan is a great resource to kind of look at what's open. And then you've got, brute force and credential stuffing that goes on. You can mine things through tools like the Harvester and that, and really kind of get a good landscape for looking at employee data. The other thing we know is in the last probably about a year or two, just about, I don't know, there's a large majority of network firewall, network appliances, VPNs, and that on the outside that have just been compromised from, having CVE exploits get compromised, and that lets the actor in. So you've got kind of these initial recon areas that the attackers are just really ready and running to hit at any time. And then you've got other things that come into place when you're looking at how they get their foothold, how do they establish, their more secure prevalence in the environment through like an admin account or service account. And sometimes that's phishing. Again, we mentioned brute force, or by getting through the vulnerabilities like we saw with Exchange, where a lot of the ransomware actors jumped on top of that web shell and came in. And then once they're in the environment, we see all kinds of legit tools used. You see them dumping creds with things like Mimikatz, and once they've got an elevated access, they're now moving throughout the environment, and they're setting up beacon to get persistence and other mechanisms to stay in the environment. And ultimately, as they go through, they will exfiltrate your data, get the binaries compiled, push out the encryption, and then you get your payment, and really they're nailing you down. So that's what we know. And what we look at is we break these down and we say, okay, there's technology deficiencies on the outside that lets them in. There's usually a challenge into unmanaged devices at some level. A lot of the attacks we've seen are we've seen challenges with them from I want to say not necessarily shadow IT, but through the VPN. There's all kinds of new entry points maybe through the users on the VPN that might not be as easy to detect as before. And then your Active Directory. I can tell you, you can spend all the money you want on engineers and other technology and things like that. Hardening your AD environment is probably one of the #1 things you can do. And we'll talk about how NDR can help validate some of that. And then you've got just segmentation. If you're able to hop across trust easily, if your networks are flat, it's going to be easier to encrypt you across the board. If your software distribution crosses every network, every trust environment, don't be surprised if the actor leverages that to push to ransomware, or leverages your group policy like Clop does in some cases to push it. And again, your backup and restoration we know is key, but you'll be surprised how many people can't restore when they've got cloud backups. They haven't really tested a full compromise of that environment, and then how do they get the environment back up and running when they're trying to restore from the cloud. So again, these are all common items, but when it comes down, you've got a lot of exposures, and many of them are unaddressed in the situation against ransomware. So let's take it a step forward, and what I want to do is sort of talk to how the network can help offset some of these things. And I break it down sort of into these 4 key things: Iocs, exploit, tools, and phishing. But if we look at the middle item there on the slide, and we kind of take it from the network's perspective, and let's assume you're going to put something like EDR in the environment, and that's really, again, the first step. There's still lots of things that when an attacker's in and living off the land, you need to be able to make sure you're aware of, and you're able to focus on that. So if we take a little deeper dive and we think of things like Iocs, I think they're great. As you saw, I worked at FireEye for quite a few years in my career, and this example of, okay, great, I got a hit. What that means is the actor's already in your environment, or the Ioc's bad. Okay, and we know Iocs have a very short shelf life, so they're good for a couple things. They're good to see if I've already got a detection. So if somebody comes out with a new blog, you can go look up your Iocs. You can see if you've already got something in the environment. But they really do have a short shelf life, and other than that, they might be good for attribution of what the actual threat actor is. So if we've got something like Avedon and we knew their Iocs and we get a hit by them, okay, does that mean it's Avedon? Maybe not, but it's usually a better sign that we may have some level of attribution in who it is. But again, they're mostly short-lived. So we want to go beyond that and kind of get away from that low-hanging fruit in our process. And what NDR will do is it will look at a lot of things very early in the phase of sort of the kill chain and the attack. And if you just look at initial access on its own, most of these attacks are going to look at a couple things. They're going to have some domain associated with it, and we're going to talk about how you can pick up some of these suspicious domains. And if you're an organization you'll see there's a lot of ways to detect doppelganger domains in your environment. There's also ways to see if phishing's bypassed your filters. And then there's also just all kinds of different things that they get access to your passwords, or we talked about exploits. So let's dive into these a tad bit. Now, I like breaking down domains because this is a really good example of, I just was talking to one of my team members today who was hunting, and they just picked up an extension like the live extension, and they went and said, let me see every single domain with the .live extension, and I'll come back to why they did that. But and it's new in the environment in the last 3 days. And then what we start looking at is registrars. We start looking at creation dates and those items. And absolutely, boom, we've got a hit on a malicious, initial access attack on it. And the reason they picked up live was we saw when researching ICE ID being used in some of these campaigns, we saw some of the .live domains. We saw the same ASNs being used, and we sort of isolated some of that data. And when you're looking at things like phishing and the domains, they're going to use some type of mechanism that makes you want to click on it. And for example, this is a real life example where Canada Post may have been targeted through a phishing campaign, or people who read Canada Post. And you can see there's just different variations of the domain. It's great. We can watch all the phishing forums. We can try to keep up with that all the time. But what's great is if I knew all my company domains, I can essentially in NDR set that up, and I can look for everything that's a doppelganger. And that's really key to do. The other thing I can do is I can look at everything that's assigned with one register, and you look at domains that are usually created within a short period of time. So everything you see here is associated with a ransomware campaign where these were domains used against different customers, essentially, of different vendors, not even us necessarily, that were out there. And in this phase, these were created between November and December, and they were also associated with one registrar. So think about it from an actor's point of view. I've got to run a phishing campaign, for example. That means I got to go register my infrastructure. If it's not already registered, I got to get it prepped. So I'm running it like an operation. I've got to get it up and running. I might be going to 1 or 2 different sites, depending on how stealthy I want to be. And then I go ahead and get that set up and push it out. So NDR has great ways to kind of pick that up and see those patterns in the domains, as well as let you hunt on that information so that you can find when suspicious domains are coming into the environment and get ahead of them in the, when they're not being detected by other things like EDR. Now, this is nothing new here. RDP is the top intrusion vector. Maybe there's some stats that change that here and there, but brute force connections there's a lot of noise when somebody's brute forcing you from the outside, and you can try to play whack-a-mole and filter them out. Maybe you've got to feed into abuse IP or something like that you're actually, trying to pick that up. But that is really inefficient, and unless you can get it fully automated, you're spending a lot of time essentially playing a whack-a-mole detection approach, which doesn't work very well in the long run. So we look at kind of the characteristics of RDP and what you see on the network. We see a couple different patterns. You have what I call the direct or the spread brute force. And direct is that they're usually coming at a small set of targets, and they're trying to get into that target. So you might see them, maybe you've got a VPN gateway with RDP exposed, and they're just constantly trying to hit that one target all the time because they know that's your exposed infrastructure. And at some point, if it's not protected, they're going to get in. The other is a spread, and these are like what I was mentioning with the abuse IP. When you see the things hitting abuse IP, those are sort of campaigns hitting, across the world in a lot of cases, and they're just shooting every single IP that's external in your environment, seeing if there's a way they can get in. And in many cases, when they get into the environment, it's sort of luck and a matter of if I've got enough data and you've got enough things exposed, I'm going to get in. What's interesting is when you look at these attacks, the initial brute force is pretty small from a network standpoint. Okay, it's under 100 bytes, and it has very few destination packets. But we do know, though, as soon as they connect, that connection time goes up to about 2 seconds, and it usually becomes about a 3,000 to 4,000 byte connection. Okay, and that's how we know we can actually monitor for brute force by looking for things that have maybe multiple or different hits, being the direct or spread brute force. And then they go from a small amount of data from the same IP or same domain to a large amount of data, and you'll want to make sure you know your admin connections and things like that. But in reality, your admins shouldn't be doing the first stage of that RDP brute force. You should see the brute force, and then you should see them get through, and you'll see that connection time. And those are where you want to get in immediately and investigate that and get in front of them. Now, if we move on a little bit to exploits, these can, or let's stay with RDP for a minute. If we look at RDP, it's sort of how it can be affected over the VPN. This is also, you can pick this up pretty easy on NDR, because what we see is a couple of things. We on a Windows environment, you're going to see all the Kerberos stuff come through, and NDR has models to look at, like, if you got certain 100 number of TCP session connections, that's typically a brute force with the certain lockout or the revoke key stuff that you see on the screen there. And we had a couple of really good examples in probably the past year where when people migrated to the VPN, we get called in on IRs where individuals were saying, "Oh, I've got ransomware, I've got malware in my environment I can't detect." And what happens is they were basically having their accounts locked out on different systems or on one or two systems. And it's a pretty telltale sign that that's probably an RDP brute force locking out your account, and you just don't realize it. And in many cases, it is just a misconfiguration. And in this particular case, we tried not to get pulled in on the IR, and we convinced them, look, you've got somebody RDPing in, and they were like, no, we've got everything locked down. So we said, all right, we dropped in our tools. Here's where it's coming from VPN. Looks like, you look at the logs on the VPN server, look, it's down to one of these two hosts. Turns out, home network user, RDP open, being essentially those campaigns that spread, being hit with the campaign of spread of their user account, locking them out of the network. And again, that's exactly how the attackers get in. One of these times, they're actually going to get through that account. And then now you've got somebody on the VPN coming in from the outside, and you've got to now triangulate that back as the initial access vector into the company. And that's very common what we run into. We just got done with a couple of similar cases where, a lot of these seem to be coming through VPN users now, where they're being brute forced on the outside. And then they're getting in, and from there they're able to get further into the infrastructure, dub creds, and pivot access. So if you're watching that RDP come through, you can see it as it comes through the VPN environment. The exploits, and I use this older exploit from 2019 because this was with Maze, and it was a really good example of how you can hunt for it, and you can't always see the traffic on an NDR without either the decryption or whether or not the initial piece comes through the URI. You can't see the pivots from it sometimes in the IPs, and that some of the unique characteristics I mentioned with the domains before. But in this case, you had the Netscaler vulnerability where they were looking for this comp file first, and then they would essentially pivot to an XML file and exploit the bots. So if you think about it across the network, your Qualys scanners, your Tenable scanners, they're doing the same thing. They're looking for this comp file to see, are you vulnerable? So you want to make sure you're filtering that stuff out. But you can look for those same exact strings that your scanners are looking for across the URI, as well as any proof of concept code that's out there that does this pivot. And you can hunt for that, or you can set up automatic detections to look for that coming from external sites. And that's just one way you can pick up these CVEs. So when new CVEs come through on network equipment, we tend to try to dissect them down, find out, is there TLS fingerprints, or is there things like URL strings that they have to check or have to execute to go ahead and run that. And then you filter out the things like the scanners that are going to be looking for it, so you're not chasing bad traffic in the environment. Now, let's take the one that everyone likes to blame these days. And I see we have a chat comment, and it looks like the question might be, what, if anything, can I do to prepare myself from something like this ahead of time, before this attack hits? Okay, so there are several things you can do before that initial access gets in the environment. And I did briefly talk to a couple of them, and I'm going to get even deeper into some of these. But I mentioned the open source intelligence recon up front. Make sure you know what's exposed. If you're not looking at your user base at Have I Been Pawned, if you're not looking at yourself through Shodan or something that else can scan your enterprise, if you're not looking at harvesting your data, you don't even know what your exposure of users is outside, and you may want to reduce that. You may want to change some of your accounts that are different that might have higher privileged access. So for example, if I've got admin users outside, do I really want them having the same context of admin account that's exposed externally? Probably not. The other thing that you might look at too, outside of that intelligence is, shut down your RDP, your SSH from being exposed externally. Make sure it's behind two-factor authentication. NDR detects it when it gets back behind it, but again, those technologies will actually make it more difficult for the brute force attack to work too. So that's just a couple. And I'll pivot into phishing at this point. And when we look at phishing, this is another one. Obviously, you got email filters that try to prevent something like this, but we know stuff gets through email. And there's a couple things you can do. You can set up an abuse mailbox for users to forward things, and hopefully your users are educated at some level. They can say this looks suspicious. They can send it in there, and we can take a look at it. The other thing you can do from a network perspective is we can actually look at some of the download bytes. So what we're actually looking for is something that came through email, pivoted likely to a domain, and these domains are usually going to be first seen. Now we've got a lot of pivots to Google lately on some of these, and you've got those long encrypted Google URLs. So what you're looking for is it comes through email, it's a pivot to an external address, and then there's a certain amount of data downloaded from it. If you think about it, users do click URLs in email and stuff, but that's kind of bad behavior in many cases anyway. They should be going to the source a lot. So we're actually looking for the patterns of something comes through, it's initiated from the email, it's going outbound. If you can see the URIs on it, you're looking for new domains, suspicious domains, you're looking for hard-coded IPs, you're looking for things that redirect, and you're looking for download bytes that are larger than just an initial page rendering in many cases. And those things are all stuff you can hunt for, as well as you can sort of set automated models up to pick that up in the environment. So, very good to help pick up those campaigns. Now, we go a little bit beyond phishing, and we start to look at, okay, they're in the environment. And if we didn't get them at that first stage, we're now looking for, well, most attackers may use something like PSExec. And I think if you look at all the ransomware pages out there, you're going to see PSExec is a prominent tool used by them. The problem is, many of you may also use it for your admin capabilities, and you may use it to move around the network. You may use it to push tools, things like that. You're going to find it's pretty limited when you look at it from a network perspective, though, how much an admin actually does that. And some of the things we're looking for with PSExec is how it goes across the SMB infrastructure. So, for example, we can see when files are created using PSExec. We can see when web pages are open, tools are being pushed. And you're also looking at things like the HTTP protocol. Are we actually running something like PSExec or something else to kick off the remote management? Did you use PowerShell to kick off the remote management? Those are key things that you're looking for. When you look at your admins, you've got a certain number of accounts and devices that are going to be doing that. They're likely not going to be pushing it across shares. They're not going to be pushing it from the domain controller to multiple endpoints. And those are all things that would stick out. And you're able to kind of see this is unauthorized activity in the environment. I need to get in front of it and question it and make sure it's valid. Now, you take it a step further, and we know when I worked back at Foundstone, we used to teach hacking exposed to some of the key agencies, and pillaging was what we called the tactic of looking for data that I can use. I'm looking for scripts that have passwords. I'm looking for password files. I'm looking for anything that has good data in it that can help me get a leverage, especially if I can't dump credentials in the environment. So, these groups are looking for password files. Some of them were looking for your key passes. The good thing is this stuff is all visible over the wire. And what I think is more important here is very much how phishing is treated, and you educate your users. NDR is one of the best, let's call it user training tools for passwords. So we know passwords is a problem. We try to implement all these things, but you know what? Bad password hygiene can be isolated to users. It can be isolated pretty quickly of like how bad it's exposed. And that's because you can see who's creating the files. You can see who's posting them everywhere. You can see where they're posting them. You can see who has access to them. So NDR picks up that stuff just by looking for the files in your environment. You can clean them up in your environment. You can also figure out who's the users that are most susceptible to kind of bad password hygiene in the environment. And what you'll be surprised is when we look, this is just an example of some of the stuff we see. You've got, encoded passwords used on applications that are being built. basic auth being used on applications that, somehow got through the cycle or legacy. People don't realize you're giving up stuff. In fact, if your AD is not using the right secure LDAP setup, you're going to see your apps are securely connected to AD, and then underneath it, you've got all this clear text username, password data going underneath it. MDR picks that up pretty quickly if you don't have secure LDAP stuff enabled. FTP in those. And then I love the list on the right here. This is an actual example of what's picked up in just one environment. You've got master password lists, you've got database password lists, you've got Chrome password lists, you name it. Like, we find it all. In fact, at some point, I'm sure we'll come out with a large study of the challenges of password hygiene and how it really needs to be addressed at a different layer. And NDR does a great job of continually kind of pressuring you to address this internally as you see it, and it's an open hole just waiting to explode on you. So again, you can get in front of it by locking this stuff down, shutting it down, as well as teaching your users better password hygiene, which will help keep the actors out at some level. And you can also see even more stuff. So this is an example of we're searching for key paths throughout the environment. We find the key paths on the shares, so we know, okay, certain users in the environment are using key paths as a file store. And this is something that one of the actors did to try to take the key path files and decrypt them. Well, once you do that, and you know where the key path file stores are, you can actually see who's copied them off of the drive. So that's what you're looking for. Who's extracted them? Was it an insider? Is it an insider threat? Is it a bad actor like a ransomware actor? Why are they doing it? So now we're early in the phase. We can pivot. We can shut that down. Get that actor kicked out of the environment, as we still see him pillaging in the environment. So that's a great way to kind of get ahead of the password problem, see if people are abusing it from both an insider and an external actor like a ransomware group. Now, I like where we're heading with, you got to get in front of the exfiltration. And, we just put out a white paper recently where we shut the exfiltration down midstream. We got engaged, and fairly quickly the actor saw us rolling out tools. We threw in some containment immediately and shut down their exfiltration and kicked them out of the environment. And, you've got to detect this stuff before they exfiltrate, otherwise you're in trouble. So again, the hygiene on the passwords is key. And then, pivoting off to find that, as I mentioned. Now, so let's say what's an actor do in the cycle? They also do a level of discovery. And you got tools like, Bloodhound and that go through and really enumerate your environment. Users may do it also manually at some level. And in cases, they may be looking for documents, but they're also looking for your password policy. And this is where I was talking about the AD hardening. When we jump on a ransomware incident response engagement, one of the first things we do is drop about 10 or 15 Active Directory recommendations to contain and harden the environment and get you set up for remediation. And when we do that, there's all these findings such as like disable W digest, implement lapse, look at your groups and who has access, look at scheduled tasks, all these different things. But what's good is a lot of that has to deal with how people are using enumeration and getting into it. And what we want to do is we want to know those enumeration signs. So we've got kind of 7 key things here. And we can also see some of the hardening aspects just by looking at this too. So for example, if we look at enumeration from what we call an opnum standpoint, and what we want to do there is opnums are pretty much like log IDs at some level in a SIM. So like you think about like event log ID 4872 or something that you might look at in a SIM. We see similar items inside of the network, and those are essentially called opnums. And when you look at something like enumeration, you're going to look for things like password policy enumeration is opnum 44. Now, you can't just search for opnum 44 because even user accounts, when they change them, are going to change opnum 44. In fact, when you're looking at it, there's usually something after that happens. So they may enumerate it, and then they're going to do like, I think it's opnum 58, where now they're changing the password. And they may not be changing it. They may just be enumerating it. These are ways you can look at how they're trying to identify accounts, how they're trying to identify rights. And most of this should only be done by admin users. So when you start to see other accounts, or you see an admin doing it uncommon, because we know the ransomware actors like to compromise, key admin accounts or service accounts. And we see that enumeration coming from one of those more than normal, then that's when it sets off a trigger. You can also do the same for network enumeration with opnum 8. So I see we have a question, And let me go ahead and pivot and see what that question is and how I can answer it for the audience. Okay, what is the suggestion in regards to the ransom? Do we pay it or not? We've kind of hit a stance on my side of not to pay it. And, I actually tweeted a little bit about this. I think the pipeline with DarkSide was a great example. I was shocked that they paid it, but then, I think they probably traced back the payment and shut down the ransomware server. And I don't have evidence of that on my side, but that's probably one of the reasons why they may have paid it. But what you're doing when you pay the ransom is you're encouraging the actors to continue. Now, the challenge with that is that you'll see the actor will try to DDoS you, and then you've got to go get your Cloudflare and that set up or whatever to avoid DDoS. And you're going to also have them call your customers. They're going to call your competitors. They're going to call anyone they can to try to get you to pay. And the reality is, if you pay, you just now have encouraged them to go on to the next group. Whereas imagine if I ransomed, like Avedon, I think had 9 or 10 this morning that were new posted on their board. Imagine if I ransom all 9 companies. I've got a significant effort into that, to getting their data, to getting everything ready, and not one of them paid. Man, that's a bummer. Now I'm going to have to do it again. And imagine the next 9 don't pay. Okay, at some point, this business isn't profitable. And then, they're going to attack people. You saw with AXA, they essentially said they're not going to pay ransom in France. I think that was the right stance. But then there you go. They get attacked. And, I'm glad they held that stance. I think that's the appropriate one. And we don't want to encourage this activity. It's essentially like paying a criminal to leave you alone. At some point, it's going to backfire like it is. And it's just, the problem's been getting worse and worse because we've been paying. And that was the stance maybe a year and a half ago. So pay them, you get your data back. Okay, that's not always true now. They're trying to double tap you for money. And they're essentially getting much more ruthless. So again, the recommendation is don't pay. Now, I'm going to pivot back to the enumeration. And what I wanted to go through a little bit deeper here when we look at the enumeration is, you got to make sure that certain things in your environment you're aware of on a network side. And you can't just drop in and say, oh, I'm going to look at all the enumeration, because you're going to be overwhelmed with the noise. It's kind of like when you turn on the EDR the first time and you've got all this stuff and you're like, oh my God, I don't know what to dig into. So we do know scanners, administrators, proxies will enumerate. I do not recommend filtering out administrators. Those accounts are used. They do compromise. What I recommend is understanding administrator devices, administrator habits, looking at those, looking at the flow that the administrators use, trying to lock those down at some level from a monitoring standpoint. So when they go outside of that, we know that this isn't normal admin activity and we should question it. As we move on to something like lateral movement, and we get past the execution, this is another fairly key thing. Right before they're either exfilling or they're trying to understand the environment, they're going to move around everywhere. They're going to copy their files where they need to. They may be hopping across trusts to consolidate data. They're looking for your file servers. If you've got a global org, they're going to go to every one of your file servers, figure out how to consolidate that as much as possible and try to upload it to like a cloud service provider or something like that. So you can watch things like, the lateral movement with this PS exec pushing some of your stuff. We know they're moving their tools across the environment. There's lots of ways you can detect that. And then, again, we talked about, what happens when you start looking at administration capabilities not on admin devices. That's also something that will trigger. So you kind of break these down and, you've got bat files, zip files going across the network. You'll be surprised. These groups, they name their tools, like they'll name their zip file, ransom.zip, whatever, the name of their own actor, the name of the tool, all kinds of things. We actually track all the file names and everything, and we look for patterns in them, and you just see them go across the wire. And in some cases, then you're also looking for, well, what's the normal size of things being transmitted across, where are the normal locations, what goes outside of that. So if something's moving to multiple destinations, that's a red flag. Why is the same file being copied to 20 different systems? Why is it being pushed to 100? Why is it being pushed to 5 even? And you're going to see only admins do a lot of that stuff. And you've also got hashes that, but some of that stuff is kind of short-lived also, as it's kind of in the IOC world, and it's only got a little bit of time. Now, you also got things where an attacker's not always going to have access to the tools from like a GUI perspective. So you can see this is an example where PowerShell's actually running the WinRM. And we know Beacon, you'll connect to Beacon, you'll see things being ran from PowerShell that will actually do the remote management, that will kick off things. And those are other ways you can kind of see that behavior happening across the wire where, the connection wasn't necessarily initiated the way it normally would by an admin, and that should set off a flag and help us catch the lateral movement. So again, really kind of key point to get in front of it. They're not yet encrypting. They're moving through the environment. They're figuring out how to do things. So what we do is we again go to the opnums. We look for certain opnums where they're creating services, and those are just some of them on the screen. So again, very similar to how you're hunting through logs or analyzing logs. The network has capabilities to watch this activity. We can also watch it when it's on unmanaged devices or devices not logged, because if you got a new device put on the network, nobody put the EDR on it. You got a new server, no one set up the Splunk floater or whatever you got on it. Boom, we pick it up anyway. So that's where the gap is. We can also help tell you where the unmanaged devices are and make sure you can get that protection on them. So the network provides you a good layer of visibility into that. And then we take it a step further, and now we're looking at exfil, we're looking at impact in C2. And this is great when you dig into the details, because we've got things that hard-coded IPs stick out pretty big on the network. And when you look at it, you're probably only going to see a few of them. And, those are on the network constantly. Like maybe you've got a feed to a third party or another, function that it happens every week. It happens all the time. But what happens when that new hard-coded IP shows up today and we've never seen it on the network? That's a flag. How many hard-coded IPs do you think come on a network every week? It's not as many as you would imagine. And we investigate almost every one of them in environments probably under about 10,000 nodes, because it's just not that common to see certain pivots of downloads and go into hard-coded IPs. You might be looking at ICMP and thinking that it's just a ping in the environment or something like that, but yet when you open it up on the network, it's actually got port 22 using ICMP. Those are things that, should set off flags we should be looking at. And then you've got multiple ways to detect beacon traffic. And some of the things I like to see there is if people are using the default stuff with beacon, the timings of the certificates are exactly a year apart. There's all kinds of flags that you can pick up on them that catch the beacons over the network. So, it's pretty easy to pick that up. We did a blog recently on ICE ID where we picked up beacon and then we picked up ICE ID afterwards. And again, we know those are tools that are used by the ransomware actors. So you're getting in front, you're shutting it down before, they're able to exfiltrate. And then, at this point, if you're actually looking for file extensions, the reality is you're encrypted. Okay, and NDR is your last piece in the puzzle here, and you're already kind of at a trouble situation, and there's not much you can do other than, okay, we know we're encrypted. Here's the extent of the encryption, and file names for ransomware is becoming harder and harder to deal with from something like an NDR perspective or even a detection, because they do randomize them now. I mean, there's hundreds of file extensions. We're trying to regex detect them, things like that. They do get better and better at their patterns and how they're creating them and things like that. So, if we see that on the NDR, we know it's already too late. You can look for things like that to see if you've only got one or two encryptions, and you might be able to stop the spread of it if you can get in front of it. So if you got a remote office that got encrypted, it hadn't quite got past the trust, NDR can pick you up and help you stop the impact. That's pretty good. But again, I'm going to come back to, you need EDR too. You need to be able to contain it from that aspect. And, you do have NDR that integrates a lot of times with EDR, so you can kind of kick that off if you needed to and contain it also. So it's a pretty good sign to maybe limit the impact. But at this point, it is pretty much too late in the cycle. And, just to give you sort of, the real pain, this is what's out there, folks. If you're not aware, these are all the different groups, their leak sites. Maybe a couple of them got shut down in the last few days, but in reality, you're dealing with people who are running a full-fledged business. If you're on this site, it's too late. People got your data. Researchers got your data. Other companies got your data. It's probably being recompiled, sold back on the market. Your customers, your other functions that you might engage with from a business aspect are going to see your data, and they're going to start coming back to you, asking you what's going on. So again, you're kind of in trouble at this point if that happens. Now, I want to wrap up with a couple of things and just where you can get more information about how we pick up some of this, how we pick up the early signs. I did a pretty extensive thing on Maze about a year back. You know, there's some really good, maybe even more in-depth perspectives on how we get in front of things like Maze and you know, I think Clop and some of these use some of the same tactics at some level. We've got some things on TLS fingerprinting for some of these. You know, we did have involvement with all 4 of the Hades incidents, and I think there's only people who said they're aware of 3. There were 4 that we know about. We had involvement with them all, and you know, not necessarily convinced I was a pure ransomware actor, but you know, some good breakdown in there of some of the tools and stuff using it, and you can't get ahead of those. There's some other things on how NDR looks at things like the zero logon and those, and absolutely, if you're thinking about paying the ransom and things like that, you know, read the dark reading item around the OFAC stuff, because you will, if you pay a ransomware group that's on that list and you don't really work with them, you're subject to large fines. If you do work with them, you're still going to probably get fined according to their guidance, but it's maybe at a lighter, you know, a lighter fine rate. But you do want to work with them if you are going to pay there. There's plenty of firms that can help you negotiate and stuff. But again, you know, unless you're completely immobile, I would suggest you figure out how to restore. You get in front of how you restore. Assume you're going to get attacked. Assume you need to get in front of it, shut them down before they encrypt you and cause a massive impact to your environment. And that's really what we want to do. That's what NDR provides. It looks at the AD hygiene in the environment. If you know what you're doing, you can see all the user account, password policies. You can see if some of your AD hardening stuff is in place. As you see it communicating across the network that shouldn't be. So and we'll eventually come out with a little more detail on those items that we do around AD and how NDR helps validate that they've actually been put in place and that you are limiting things like trust communication and that across the environment. So I've got, you know, a little bit more here to wrap up, but if you do need more data or information, you can reach out to us on the Awake Labs site. If you're, you know, in the middle of an incident or need help, we've got a really good team here. You know, I mentioned some of the organizations I worked with in the past. You know, some of my teams come from some of the best of those orgs and work with me quite a while. I've been in this business on both the offensive and defensive side, and you know, we'd be happy to help you. We work with the legal and insurance if needed, and can guide you through the whole process. So with that said, I'll go ahead and you know, in closing, I want to thank you both for thank everybody for joining, and both, you know, Arista and Blackhawk here, Blackhawk Data. We're very happy for you coming to see our presentation today. We look forward to working with you on any upcoming projects. And you know, if you want to reach out, we're happy to give you a demo on NDR. We definitely look forward to speaking with you at another event. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes and just see if there's any other questions that anyone has. Okay, I think we do have a couple of comments in the item. We got one from Grady, it looks like. And Grady's asking, what, if anything, can I do to prepare myself for something like this ahead of time before the attack? I think we did answer that, sorry. And then the other one was on the ransom. So yeah, we did address both those, but as you can see, I just want to make sure you're aware there's lots of early warning signs. And again, we don't want to, you know, we don't want to recommend paying the ransom because it encourages these actors. All right, if we have no further questions, thank everybody. I'd like to thank everybody again. And again, Blackhawk Data and Arista, we're glad to present to you today. And take care, everyone. And please watch the live stream or record it in the future. Thank you.